I'm Fernando Calderón-Figueroa, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. The paper is titled The Dilemmas of Spatializing Social Issues. It has recently been accepted for publication at Socius, the open access journal of the American Sociological Association. The main idea behind the paper is that it uses the case of a program in Toronto, the Priority Areas program, implemented between 2006 and 2011, as a case for discussing the impact of targeted social policy over geographically fixed areas of cities. And we are discussing some of the unpredicted consequences of those kinds of policies in that paper. The paper is co-authored by both me, Professor Dan Silver from the University of Toronto Scarborough, and a colleague, Olympia Bidian. We came up with the idea for the paper through conversations around the impact of planning decisions on the trajectories of neighborhoods. It was, I think, a combination of interest in cities, in neighborhoods, and the fact that at the time I was a TA for a course. He was teaching on the sociology of neighborhoods at Scarborough. And through the course, we got to meet a bunch of students. A few of them had lived in the priority areas during the time the policy got implemented, and they had mixed feelings about the program, especially behind the idea behind of why do certain parts of the city get designated while others did not, despite having very similar features and similar stories and trajectories. So under that assumption, and with some of the theory in mind from urban studies, Dan and I started working on this particular project when we thought about, this program, the Priority Area program, is a particularly interesting case of a planning decision that segmented a group of neighborhoods with specific boundaries around them, gave them some resources for community development. At the same time that it did that, it left out some others that were actually in very similar conditions. We wanted to see what some of the effects had been, not just from the policy's goals, but mostly in terms of how it affected the trajectories of their desirability and other kinds of changes over time. The discussions around the program started in the early 2000s, around 2003. Between 2003 and 2005, the program got implemented between 2006 and 2011. After that, it was redesigned, and now it's still going on under a new name, the Neighborhood Improvement Areas. Our study covers the trajectories before the program got implemented, so the few years before that, and a few years after the specific Priority Areas program, so 2006 and up to 2018 in some of our data. We had a few hypotheses based on some of the inspiration for the paper on a theoretical level came from Amartya Sen's theory about the social costs of targeted policies in the realm of social policy, and some of it also got inspired by the work of Robert Sampson on neighborhood effects. So we were inspired by these traditions, and we considered basically two main hypotheses and a third one that was related to the other main two. So the first was that through this kind of program, you usually would have the informational distortion. That means that in some cases, neighborhoods that should be included are left out because they happen to be outside the boundaries of the areas. And in some other cases, areas within the neighborhoods designated are actually not wealthy sometimes, but like upper middle class areas, for instance. So what happens when you do these kinds of geographic designation is that you are including people or families that may not need those kinds of extra supports. The other one, which was one of the most interesting, was that this kind of targeted policies with geographic boundaries create incentive distortions in the sense that they affect how people read the city. So once you add a boundary and you create like an official designation for an area, people would associate a lot of things around that area with, for instance, the fact that they are now quote unquote in need. So that idea, the fact that you would have now these kinds of policies and areas of the city designated, we hypothesized that it would potentially negatively affect how people perceive the areas, and that will be reflected on the level of desirability that's usually measured through things like home value, rents, and the number of building permits that are requested to the City of Toronto. That was our second hypothesis, and we used difference in difference models to measure that. And our third sort of angle, not exactly a hypothesis, was that the mechanism behind all of this was a process of stigmatization. So basically meaning that throughout the process, what happened was that these areas, after you created the boundaries around them, some of the bad reputation, crime, and things that had happened in some of these areas become associated with the program's name, and therefore they are expanded, not just to the places where they happen, but to all, like every area that falls under the umbrella of a priority area designation. It's kind of like casting a shadow on part of a city, you know. To assess that, we collected newspaper articles, magazine features, and other previous research and policy documents from the city to just establish to what degree we could find some level of mentions to stigmatization. And we found quite a bit of that, and we include some of that on the paper, including, for instance, community leaders from some communities that were not designated, saying, look, we live in this community which should have been considered, let's say, the 14th priority area because we are also in need, but we happen to be outside the boundaries. So yeah, those are the main methods that we used. What we found were, for the most part, there's evidence that the program had negative externalities towards these neighborhoods. That means that beyond their goals, we are not measuring the effects, the specific effects of the program on their intended goals. Beyond those goals, there seems to have been a negative impact on the overall reputation of these areas, which was visible in the way the rate of growth, for instance, of home values and rents in the areas, building permits, but it was also visible in the kind of way that the neighborhoods were talked about in the press and through community leaders. There was an overall sentiment that the fact that these areas received some resources through this program did not make up for the fact that there had been negative associations with the name of the program and with overall the area that the geographic boundary had created. We also found that there was significant evidence of informational distortion, this idea that some areas, quote-unquote, non-deserving had been included and some areas, quote-unquote, deserving had not been included in the priority areas. I think our main recommendation for policymakers that comes out of the paper has to do with being careful with using boundaries for targeted social policy. The overall assessment of the problems of the communities were, for the most part, accurate, but the solution of creating special areas can have all these negative consequences. And it's not the only way that you can do urban social policy. We suggest in the paper that a way to, and this suggestion is based on previous research, that there are ways to circumvent these externalities, these negative implications. One of them is to think about specific services and service areas without fixed boundaries, or in other words, mobile boundaries that are not as widely advertised, for instance. And one example you can think of is how fire stations are distributed across the city, and these fire stations would change areas that they serve. There may be new stations coming up because there's more density or there's more traffic or whatever. Like, the service allocation can be universally distributed across the city without creating boundaries. And also thinking in terms of how people move around the city. So another way of paying less attention to boundaries is to improve the quality of transit and access of mobility opportunities for people in the city. So we think social policy for distressed areas can be implemented in ways that do not need these types of boundaries to be created. The paper's coming up. It's going to be published, as said before, in Socius, an open access journal from the American Sociological Association. Through the fact that it's open access, we hope that people interested in this scholarly aspect of the paper can read it, because we think it's a contribution to how urban policy is made. And the fact that this paper has gone through so many iterations, we hope to continue working on some of these projects in order to make better recommendations for urban policymakers.